Welcome to day 23 of the 28-day photo challenge. Today we are doing shallow depth of field. Now there's really not much to say about how this works because it's essentially lens design, but what I'm going to do is show you how to simulate depth of field by using zoom. So that way we can get some different looks without needing super high-end equipment or anything.
Now this is one of the easiest ways to make people think that you are a much better photographer than you actually are. Now there's three ways you can achieve this. You can buy a very expensive lens. This one here was $1,000 Canadian, which in like the lens world, that's actually really cheap. But when you're just starting out with photography and you probably bought an entire phone that does everything for $1,000, buying a little compact piece of glass for the exact same price is kind of steep. However, this lens here in full frame equivalent is a 24 to 70 millimeter locked at f2.8 throughout the entire zoom range. Now, if you have a kit lens, you're likely to have an f3.5 to 5.6, and that aperture is going to adjust as you're zooming in. So if you're taking videos, that's kind of a must, because as you zoom in, it'll get darker, and that changes your entire exposure, where with photography, it's not really that big of a deal because then you can just adjust your settings to compensate for that. But when you're shooting video, you can't really adjust your exposure and everything on the fly like you can with photography without having noticeable changes in your exposure. To get the best depth of field, let's say shooting cheap, if I change my aperture to 3.5, which is going to be a good base for where most people are going to start, I'm shooting as wide open as possible. The biggest part of this is you want to find something really close to you, where if I change to 5.6 and adjust the ISO to compensate, shooting at ISO 6400, you can see that the background in the shot doesn't have as much depth of field as before, even though we're in the exact same position and all we've done is we've changed the aperture, because on a kit lens, when you zoom in all the way, you're likely to be at 5.6. Now, if we go further away from this subject, which you can see we're way too close, we can try to get a similar angle to where we were before, and now you can see that the depth of field is significantly more noticeable because we're further away. We're focusing on one subject using a zoom lens. So by compressing that depth of field down into a much shallower field of view, we're actually simulating more depth of field than we would normally have. Now, if we step this back to 2.8 while moving in and staying zoomed, now we can get a ridiculous amount of depth of field. Now, depth of field can be used in all kinds of different aspects, but depending on what you're shooting, you might want more depth of field or less, because you never want to have the over dramatic look towards every single thing, because that depth of field can get so narrow when you're zoomed in that you're losing a lot of the rest of the detail. A good example of this is if you're taking a picture of like a dog or any other animal that has a long snout, you can focus right on the end of their nose, but their eyes will be completely out of focus because the depth of field is too shallow. So if you compensate that depth of field to bring it out wider, then you could get their entire face in focus while still having tons of bokeh in the background. So your two biggest things there are buying an expensive lens which has a very large aperture. So for me, on a zoom lens, I'm using f2.8 all the way through, or you can buy a prime lens like a 50 millimeter, and you can get those pretty cheap, like an f1.7, f1.8, or you can also spend another $1,000 and get the other lens that I have, a 50 millimeter equivalent, because micro 4/3, so it's actually a 25, but it's a 2x crop, so it ends up being a 50 millimeter, and that one is f1.4. Or you could go to like the Hero lens, get the f1.2, which is insane. It's amazing. Like an 85 mil f1.8 would be a lot more usable, because you're spending a lot more time compressing everything that you're seeing into a shallow depth of field, which pushes it further away, so that actually expands your depth of field a little bit when you zoom in. So more of the subject will be in focus, but you'll have a much more blurry background, like when you're zooming in on something. Here's another good example of depth of field. There's lots of similar things. If we just get in here close, I'm going to shoot at ISO 6400 for this, and I'm going to try and get kind of in this and then have the rest of them blurry in the background. So you can clearly see that I'm not even trying when taking depth of field pictures because the lens just does it for me. It can be used in pretty much every photo that you take every day in any kind of situation. Plus, the bigger the aperture, the more light it lets in. And it's actually pretty dark right now. All the street lights and everything are on. Lights on the fence are turning on. So we're probably getting pretty close to 6. I don't have my phone or watch or anything on me, so I'm just assuming. That's pretty much it. I can't shoot anything else for today. That's gonna wrap it up. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already. That helps out a lot. Or, don't do any of it. I'm not telling you what to do.